What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and we're back for another episode of the third-person and action RPG tutorial series. So in this episode we're going to continue working with our interactions. So we have this system of Hitscan, so we can look at items to interact with them, and then we have this system of overlapping to interact with items as well. Now, until the last few episodes of the series, we only really supported overlapping interactions, but we started implementing Hitscan interactions, and once we got them working, we began making the combination work. So essentially, if we're overlapping with an item, we can interact with it, but if we're looking at another item, that takes priority. So in today's episode, we're going to be going through the logic to handle all the overlap behavior in the code instead of the blueprint, because the code is where our interaction logic is, and so if we handle a good portion of that in the code with that interaction logic, then we can determine whether we want to pass in the actor we're looking at or the actor that we're overlapping with as the interaction actor. And when we do this, our system will play nicely together. So before we hop into this episode, if you want to get caught up in the entire third-person action RPG tutorial series, you can see how we've done everything from our stamina and sprinting, our equipment, our toggling enemies, and a lot more. I'll link you to the entire playlist in the top right corner right here. Alternatively though, if you don't care about the entire third-person series and you just want to check out the interaction with Hitscan and or overlap or both, then you can check out this episode in the top right corner right here, which is the first episode of interactions, because even though you don't have to watch the rest of the series to follow along with this episode, I do recommend you watch the previous episodes on interaction. That way you know how we got to this point. Now with that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. This is a code and blueprint tutorial series, so we're going to be mainly working in the code today because we're going to be converting a few things from blueprint to code. But first things first, I want to fix a small issue that we did not catch in the previous episode. Maybe you caught it, but I did not. So I want to go to my objects, specifically my items, and make sure each item is named appropriately. So when I did some of the refactoring that I did not rename everything properly in the class defaults here. I didn't necessarily set everything properly in the class defaults either. So for our health potion and our mana potion BP, you'll see that they've reset all their values here at the start, and so have a lot of these other objects. So like our equipment, our base equipment BP will be fine, but our chest BP, helmet BP, and leg BP need to be updated. And then same with our weapons, we need to go to axe BP, dagger BP, and sword BP. And there's a couple things we want to modify in each of these, but the main one is the name. Make sure you set the names back to how they were. So health potion, and I would set their rarity as well. So health potion can be common. Compile and save. Mana potion can also be common. And a potion. Chest BP. You want to make sure that the item rarity exists here. Make it common by default. Or leave it at none and let it be read from the data table. That's fine. But name, let's call it chest. Helmet, let's call it helmet. Again, these are read from the data table, but if we set them in here to match the blueprint, I think that's a good idea. That way we do have a default value in here if it can't be read from the data table for any reason. So for our axe, I'm going to call it axe. Dagger can be dagger, and sword can be sword. I'm going to set everything to be common for the defaults instead of none. And again, everything will be read from the data table and overwritten otherwise. But I want to make sure these defaults stay in place. You can also set the weight if you want, but I'm going to keep it as 1 for everything by default. And anything that's not, I will update. So dagger wasn't, and sword wasn't. I'll make them 1 as well. Last thing here is the ID, which links up with the ID of the data table. If we exit out of this and go to the data tables, they're in blueprints data for me, and I have one for my item data table, equipment data table, and weapon data table. We're going to need all of them. In the item data table, you see this row name section here, which has 0 and 1. This is what I'm using as the index or the ID. and we want to make sure that our blueprints line up with that so we know what data to pull from, or basically what row in the data table we want to fill this information out with. For me, health potion is index 0 and mana potion is index 1, so make sure the IDs line up with that. Basically just change mana potion BP to have an ID of 1. Then we go to our equipment data table and we see our chest is ID 1, but in here it says ID 0. We need to make sure we reset this back to the correct value, which is 1. The helmet is ID 0, so we can leave it as is, but the leggings are ID 2, and we want to fix them up by changing them. Now these ones were actually correct already, but I am going to default the weight back to 1.0. As I said I would do earlier, just as a default value. That's everything in the equipment data table, so we can go to our weapon data table, and you'll see that the sword is ID 0, so if we go to that, it says ID 0, which is correct. Then we look at the dagger, which should be ID 1. And actually it is, this one did not get messed up, so we can leave it, but the axe BP should be ID 2, and you can see that it says ID 0 here in the default, so let's make sure we update that one. Now everything will work as intended. At this point, we are good to go into the code and check out our logic. So we want to start in our third-person tutorial character.cpp because this is the logic for our character class, and the character has the ability to interact when we press the E button, or the E key, or button on a controller. So I want to go down to my interact function, and you can search for it if you want, or just scroll down until you get to it. Pretty simple either way. And we're at interact here. So in interact, we can't interact if the menu is open or if the character is dead. But if the character is not dead and the menu is not open, then we are able to interact. So this next section here checks to see if we have an interaction actor that we're able to interact with via Hitscan. Hitscan is when we look at an actor or an object in the world and we're saying we want to interact with that. So our tick logic down at the bottom here has a section where we perform a line trace and determine if it hits an actor, and if it does, if it hits an actor of a certain type. If it hits an actor of each type, such as a default weapon, a default equipment, a default item, or a base NPC, then we set the interact actor to that and do any other logic that we need to do. Otherwise, we were setting interact actor to null pointer. Now this happens once per frame, so every time we're looking at something, it's going to be setting this value. But if we stop looking at it, it's going to set it to null pointer and hide the interaction pop-up if it was there. What we want to do in today's episode is in our interact function, we want to support overlap behavior. Now we have this behavior for NPCs. All this logic here is happening if we don't have an interaction actor. So if we don't have an actor that we're looking at, we start going over the overlap interaction for our character. So Hitscan is prioritized. And I'm going to prioritize NPCs overlapping over the items for now as well. So we're going to go through here. We're going to get our overlapping NPCs. And if the num is greater than 0, which means there is at least one overlapping NPC, we were just interacting with the first one. However, if overlapping NPCs.num is less than or equal to 0, that means we don't have any NPCs that we're interacting with. And at this point is where I want to put our weapon and item logic in. So I will come to this if statement where we're checking if it's greater than 0 for the overlapping NPCs and put else. And if it's else, we can then go on to our overlapping items. Our items, our weapons, and equipment are all related. The weapons and the equipment are children of items. So technically, we can go and do the same logic that we just did for the NPCs and just copy this if we want and paste it. I'll go over it here with you. But we want to get all the overlapping items. So get all items overlapping with this character. And we're going to make a T-array of actors, and I'm going to call it overlapping items. So T-array, a actor pointer, overlapping items. And then we want to get the overlapping actors, which is a function that Unreal has on actors, which determines any actors that are overlapping any component on this actor. And we want to use our overlapping items here. And for the type of class that we're using, we want to use a base item. So this is the filter, this section here. This determines what class we're looking for that's overlapping with this item. Now, get overlapping actors returns an array of actors, or rather it sets the actors in the array that you pass into it. But this filter will only return actors of this type into that array if you choose to give it one. So I called it a base item here. It's actually a default item. That's what it's called. And that is our default item class that we have here, which is the parent item class in our game. And now we can do a very simple check here for the same thing that we did with our NPC. If there is at least one overlapping item. The logic for this is pretty simple. We're just going to say if overlapping items dot num is greater than 0. Then in here we can do something simple like interact actor equals overlapping items at index 0. The problem with doing this is it's going to break our hit scan logic, or really they're going to conflict with each other because the hit scan logic is setting the interact actor to null pointer when we're not looking at it. So it's fine to do this and to assume that if we're overlapping multiple items, we want to be interacting with the first one. That will work for our game for the time being. We may need to expand it further and make it more specific going forward to make it a little bit easier to pick up certain items and things like that. But it won't change our base behavior here. This is something that will work. So what we need to do is take all this logic that is based on the overlap behavior here, so everything in the if not interact actor section, and put it into a function. That way we can check to see if there's an overlapping actor, because then we can call that function in our hit scan, and if there is an overlapping actor, then we don't want to reset the interact actor back to null pointer, which would make this section bug out. So essentially take everything in this if statement, if not interact actor, and just copy it or cut it out like I did there. Let's put it in a function below or above interact. That way it's right next to it. So I'll put it right below. So void a third person tutorial character, : determine overlapping interactables. Now this is very similar to a function we already have. If you've been following the series, you're probably familiar with determine overlapping item. But that is a blueprint implementable event that works for one specific item, but in here we need to work for more. So I'm going to use this one and we'll remove the other one and just use this one going forward because this does everything we need instead of what we needed previously. So you see I have my logic in here that was previously in the interact function. Now I can just simply change my interact function to only call the interact blueprint function if there is an interaction actor. So just change the if statement to if interact actor, change the comment to if there is an actor able to be interacted with, and we don't need to say with via hit scan, we can just say able to be interacted with, and if there is, we're going to call interact BP. Now we need to make this function in our header file. So third person tutorial character, I will go to my interact function. It is right here. We're going to say determine the overlapping interactables. Let's say determine the interactables overlapping with this character. A actor pointer determine overlapping interactables, and there we go. So now this function will exist. We'll be able to handle all the logic that we have in here. And so right now we only have NPCs and items that we can interact with. Going over the logic, if we have an NPC that we're able to interact with, we're just doing our interaction logic right here. Else, if we don't have an NPC to interact with, we're seeing if we have any items to interact with. And if we do, I'm just setting interact actor to be the first one here. And let's just make this void. I was going to return an actor pointer, which does make sense, but I'll just set interact actor in here for this episode. We may make it more complicated like I was mentioning to you earlier, but let's not do that right now. Let's make sure we can get this system working. So at this point, interact actor is being set to only overlapping items and not an NPC. But now the interact actor is being set if we can find one in this function. So if we go down to our tick again, at this point, if we go through and we say, nope, we're not looking at a weapon, we're not looking at equipment, we're not looking at an item, we were setting interact actor to null pointer, but I don't want to do that. Instead, I want to call determine overlapping interactables. And instead of setting interact actor and null pointer here, I want to set interact actor equal to what determine overlapping interactables is. So if we do interact actor equals this function, instead of setting it to null pointer, we will get the result of what this function found. So at this point, we know we're not looking at anything. So we're basically saying, is there anything we're overlapping with? Now at this point, I want to say if not interact actor. So if it's null pointer, then we will hide the interaction pop-up. So basically set it to whatever comes through here. If nothing comes through here, then just say that we should hide the interaction pop-up. If there is no actor to interact with via Hitscan or overlap. And I messed up this function, determine overlapping interactables, a actor pointer. And in the CPP, this also needs to be an a actor pointer, which I marked it as void. So a actor pointer. And since we're setting it in the tick function now, we don't have to set interact actor in here. So what we can do instead is just return the actor that we're going to interact with. So for our items specifically, we can just say return overlapping items 0. And then interact actor will be set to it afterward if we're not looking at anything else. Now interact will be valid when we come in here and call interact BP using our interact logic that we set up in the blueprint. Now one thing we need to make sure of is that all paths return a value in this function. So we were returning our overlapping items, but if it went the path of the NPC, we weren't returning anything at all. So at the end of the statement here where we say if auto NPC equals cast a base NPC, and that means we're overlapping with an NPC, regardless of whether we were entering or exiting interaction, at this point I want to return NPC. Now understand that the logic for entering and exiting the interaction with the NPC shouldn't be in this function, but this is what we'll handle in the next episode. Now that we got the proper logic in for interactions on hit scans and overlap, we can move this over to the proper spot, but this logic for interacting with our NPCs was always temporary, as we have an improved system for interactions that's going to work with NPCs specifically anyway, because they're a lot more complicated. They have things like dialogue trees and pulling up dialogue based off of where a user is in the story and other things, so it's not as simple as the items and the equipment. So simply put return NPC at the bottom of this if statement here, and at the end of the function, if we don't go into the NPC or the item, we still need to return something. In this case, we're going to return null pointer, which means we haven't found anything. If we haven't found anything, we have no interact actor that we're overlapping with. And once you've done that, you can go into your editor. Alright, so Unreal is back open. We can go back to our character class, and in the next episode, we're also going to replace everything in Interact BP with Interact BP2 here. So Interact BP2 we made a few episodes ago, which is a simplified version of this function, and it just acts on the interaction actor. I won't go over the logic here today because we've already gone over it, but we're going to use this one instead. So we can simply disconnect the Interact BP logic from everything that was in here and connect it to Interact BP2. Again, it will be cleaned up in the next episode, but just know this is what you need to do to make it work right now. And at this point you can test it. It should work a lot better with Hitscan and overlap. So if we come into our game, we should be able to overlap with an item such as our sword and not look at it and still be able to pick it up. So our overlap is working. But then I will be able to look at items as well and pick them up. I have a really far reach right now, but you can see I can pick up my dagger, my axe, my helmet, and then I can go overlap with my chest plate and pick it up in my leggings and pick them up. We'll leave the NPC until later because, as I said, there's more that needs to be done there, but technically the interactions will work with the NPC. The behavior itself will just be a little bit different than what we actually want. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode on interactions. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope it helped you set up hit scan and overlap interactions in your game. If it did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership, Patreon members, and Discord supporters. Thank you guys for all the love and support. I'm incredibly grateful. If you ran into any problems while following this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. there is a link in the description, and I would be happy to help you. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.